Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the flour-dusted counter and stared at the letter someone had slipped under her bakery door before dawn. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. No decent man will ever want you. You are too big, too loud, too much. Do everyone a favor and stop pretending otherwise. Her jaw tightened, her eyes burned. But she did not cry. She had spent 29 years refusing to cry over what this town thought of her. She folded the letter, slipped it into her apron pocket, and started the oven. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. We'd love to know what city you're watching from, so leave it in the comments below and let us see just how far this story travels. The letter was not the first. It was not even the cruelest. Clara Whitmore had been receiving messages like that since she was 14 years old the year her mother died and left her running a frontier bakery alone in the middle of Willow Creek, Montana, while the rest of the town watched and waited to see how fast a girl like her would fail. She hadn't failed. That more than anything seemed to bother people. Willow Creek in the summer of 1882 was the kind of town that looked warm from a distance. Wide main road packed hard by wagon wheels, a general store with barrels lined up out front, a church with a white painted steeple that caught the afternoon light just right. Travelers passing through on their way west often remarked that it looked peaceful. What they didn't stay long enough to learn was that peaceful places had their own particular cruelties. And in Willow Creek, those cruelties had a name. They called it honesty. Just being honest with you, Clara. Only telling you the truth, Clara. You ought to know, Clara, because nobody else is going to say it. She had heard every version of that sentence so many times that she could finish it before anyone else did. She knew the pause that came before the real words. She knew the particular way someone's eyes moved just slightly to the left when they were about to say something they had been rehearsing. She knew the soft, apologetic voice that people used when they wanted to wound you and still feel righteous about it afterward. She was 29 years old. She had dark hair she kept pinned back while she worked strong arms from years of hauling flour sacks and kneading dough before the sun came up, and a body that the women of Willow Creek discussed in the same hushed, pitying tones they reserved for drought years and dead livestock. She was a large woman, not soft, not delicate, not the kind of figure that fit neatly into the image of what a frontier wife was supposed to look like. And according to Willow Creek, that was the whole of who she was. Every morning, Clara arrived at her bakery before 5 o'clock. She built the fire in the oven herself. She measured and mixed by memory because she had done it so many times that her hands knew the ratios without being told. She set out the day's bread by 6, the pies by 8, and by the time the main road woke up and started moving, her window was full and her door was open, and the smell of warm cinnamon and baked sourdough had already drifted half a block in every direction. People came. They always came. They bought her bread and ate her pies and drank the coffee she kept hot on the back burner, and they sat at her 2 small tables and talked about their lives and their troubles and the weather and the price of cattle, and Clara listened to all of it with a patience that most people mistook for simplicity. It wasn't simplicity. It was survival. She had learned early and hard that a woman in her position could not afford to be complicated. She could not afford opinions that frightened people, or a temper that surprised them, or a sadness that made them uncomfortable. She had learned to listen more than she spoke, to agree more than she argued, to give more than she ever asked for, because as long as she was useful, people tolerated her. But tolerating someone was not the same as respecting them, and respect was the one thing Willow Creek had never offered Clara Whitmore. The morning after the letter arrived, she was halfway through the day's second batch of bread when the door opened and Margaret Hollis walked in. Margaret Hollis was 53 years old, the wife of the town's most prosperous cattle buyer, and the unofficial keeper of Willow Creek's social order. She wore her graying hair in a tight bun, and her opinions like a winter coat, always on, always visible, never removed regardless of the temperature. "Morning, Clara," she said. "Morning, Mrs. Hollis." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the wrapped loaf she'd already set aside. "The rye you asked for is ready. Wonderful." Margaret set her coin purse on the counter and tilted her head in that particular way she had, the way that meant she was about to say something she'd been thinking about since before she left the house. "I heard that Ethan Callahan came in yesterday." "He did." Clara kept her voice even. "He was asking about a weekly supply order for the ranch hands." Margaret picked up the wrapped loaf and turned it over in her gloved hands as if inspecting it, though they both knew she wasn't looking at the bread. "He's a good man, Callahan. Hard-working, decent. Comes from a solid family out of Texas, I hear." "He seems like a capable fellow." "He is." Margaret set the loaf down and looked at Clara directly. "Which is exactly why I feel I ought to say something, woman to woman." Clara felt the familiar brace move through her, the internal straightening that happened whenever someone prefaced a conversation with woman to woman. It never meant anything good. "Of course," she said. "You're a sweet girl, Clara. Everyone in town will tell you that. You've worked hard with this bakery and nobody is taking that away from you." Margaret paused. "But a man like Ethan Callahan has options. Real options. And I would hate to see you get confused about what his coming in here means." Clara looked at her. "I appreciate the concern," she said carefully. "I just think—" Margaret lowered her voice, as if what she was about to say was generous rather than devastating. "A woman in your situation ought to be realistic about what men like him are looking for. You understand me." A woman in your situation. Clara understood perfectly. She understood that Margaret Hollis had woken up that morning, thought about the way Ethan Callahan had talked to Clara the day before, and felt so alarmed by the possibility that it might mean something that she had come in here before 8 in the morning specifically to prevent it. "I'll keep that in mind," Clara said. She handed over the rye bread. She took the coins. She smiled with her mouth and kept her eyes absolutely still. Margaret left satisfied. Clara turned back to her oven and pressed her palms flat against the work table and breathed. She did not give herself long. She never did. There was too much work to do, and the work was the thing that kept her upright, the thing that had always kept her upright, the steady rhythm of purpose when everything else felt like it was trying to knock her down. She had been 14 when her mother passed, 16 when her father followed. She had been alone in this bakery since before she was old enough to fully understand what alone meant. She had built the credit system that kept 3 struggling families fed through 2 bad winters. She had negotiated her own flour contracts with the mill in Helena because no one else was going to do it for her. She had painted the sign above the door herself after the first one got knocked down in a windstorm, and she'd waited 3 weeks for someone to offer to help before she got tired of waiting. She was not the woman Willow Creek thought she was. She was harder and smarter and more capable and lonelier than any of them had ever bothered to find out, and she had stopped expecting them to. That was the part nobody understood about her walls. People in town talked about Clara as though she were fragile, as though all her quietness and patience came from weakness. They didn't. They came from a woman who had calculated precisely how much pain she could absorb in a given day and still function, and who had arranged her life accordingly. She didn't open her heart because she had opened it before and watched what happened. She didn't ask for things because she had asked before and learned the answer. She didn't hope too loudly because she had hoped before, and the silence that came back was worse than never hoping at all. She was not broken. She was strategic. And then Ethan Callahan walked back through her door at 10:30, took his hat off before he'd even crossed the threshold, and said, "Good morning, Miss Whitmore. I was hoping we could talk more about that supply arrangement." He was a tall man, lean from years of outdoor work, with dark eyes that moved around a room the way a man moved when he was used to assessing unfamiliar territory. He had the kind of quiet that wasn't emptiness. It was more like the quiet of someone who had learned to listen before he spoke and had decided that most things weren't worth saying unless they needed to be said. "Of course," Clara said. "Sit down, Mr. Callahan. Coffee, please." She poured 2 cups without thinking about it, which she noticed only after she'd set his on the table and was settling into the chair across from him. She didn't usually sit with customers. She didn't know why she'd done it. He didn't seem to think it was strange. "I was talking to my foreman this morning. he said, wrapping both hands around the cup. "We've got 11 men out at the Callahan spread right now, and they've been eating whatever the bunkhouse cook puts together, which is something I'd rather not describe in polite company." Clara felt the corner of her mouth pull up before she could stop it. "That bad? Let's say there are boots in that bunkhouse with more flavor." He looked up at her, and there was something in the look that was straightforward, without being aggressive, direct, without being rude. "I was serious yesterday about a regular arrangement. Bread twice a week, pies on Fridays if you can manage it, and maybe a discussion about meals for long drive days when we're moving cattle and the men need something that'll hold." "I can manage all of that," Clara said. "I figured you could." He said it without inflection, like a simple statement of fact, and Clara had to take a moment to process the words, because she was so accustomed to every compliment arriving wrapped in a caveat that a plain, unqualified expression of confidence felt almost foreign. "The bread would be 50 cents per loaf for the ranch quantity," she said, pulling herself back to business. "Pies run $1.25. For the drive day meals, I'd need to know the head count and the route at least 2 days in advance." "That's fair." He nodded. "More than fair, actually." "It's the same price I charge everyone else." "I know." He looked at her again, and something in his expression was careful in a way she couldn't quite name. "Mrs. Garrity, over at the dry goods, was kind enough to give me a full accounting of your business practices, your prices, your credit arrangements, your hours." Clara felt a small, cold thing move through her stomach. "Mrs. Garrity is very thorough. She also told me you were not the sort of woman I ought to be spending time with." He said it without any particular heat, simply as though reporting the weather. "Something about you being unsuitable for a man in my position." The cold thing spread a little further. "Did she?" Clara said. "She did." Ethan turned his cup between his palms. "I thanked her for the information and came straight here." Clara stared at him. "Mr. Callahan, I'm not trying to embarrass you," he said quickly. "I'm telling you because I think you ought to know that I've already heard what this town has to say, and I'm here anyway, and that's the only thing I wanted to make clear before we discussed business any further." She didn't know what to do with that. In 29 years, she genuinely did not know what to do with a man who had heard the warnings and walked toward her anyway. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She talked about bread. They spent another 40 minutes working out the details of the supply arrangement, and Ethan Callahan asked questions that told her he'd thought about it seriously, that he understood the logistics of what he was asking, that he wasn't going to be the kind of customer who made arrangements and then changed his mind at the last moment and expected her to absorb the cost. He knew things about supply chains and seasonal pricing that most of the ranchers in the area had never bothered to learn. He'd spent time in Texas, he mentioned once in passing, and before that, Kansas, and before that, a couple of years working freight routes along the Missouri River, and all of it came through in the way he talked about practical problems. Not with bravado, with attention. She noticed, and she told herself firmly not to make anything out of it. He was a customer. He was a good customer, the kind she needed, the kind who paid on time and didn't expect special consideration just because he was important. That was all. That was exactly all it was, and she was going to make sure it stayed that way because she was not 20 years old anymore. She had not been 20 years old in a long time, and she knew better than to sit across a table from a man who asked good questions and felt anything about it. He stood when he was ready to leave, which was a small thing, a period-appropriate courtesy that half the men in Willow Creek had forgotten or never learned. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. "I'll have one of my men come in Thursday for the first order," he said. "And I'd be obliged if you'd send word if there's anything about the arrangement you need to adjust." "I will." He settled the hat on his head and paused at the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Callahan, that coffee was the best I've had west of St. Louis." He left before she could respond to that. She stood behind her counter and listened to his footsteps cross the boardwalk, and listened to the sound of him untying his horse from the post outside and riding back down the main road, and she stayed very still for a long moment in the particular silence he left behind. Then she went back to her bread. She was not going to make anything out of it. She was absolutely certain she was not going to make anything out of it. But she did. She realized, 3 days later, find herself checking the quality of the loaves she packed for the Callahan order with a slightly more critical eye than she usually applied. Just professional standards. That was all. The town noticed before she did. It took about 2 weeks, which was actually longer than Clara might have expected, given that Willow Creek had elevated the observation of other people's business to something approaching an organized sport. Ethan Callahan came in twice during that time, once to check on the first order, and once for something he claimed was a question about Friday pies, though the conversation ran to nearly an hour and covered topics well beyond baked goods. He asked about her credit system. Not in the pitying way that people sometimes did, the way that meant they thought it was naive or impractical or evidence of a soft-headedness that was going to ruin her business eventually. He asked about it the way someone asked about a strategy they were genuinely trying to understand. "How do you decide who qualifies?" he said. "I know who's struggling," Clara said. "You spend enough time in a place you can see it. And if someone takes advantage, it's happened 3 times in 5 years. She straightened a stack of wrapped loaves without really needing to. 2 of them came back and paid when things improved. 1 of them never did. "And that didn't make you stop?" "2 out of 3 came back," she said. "That's a better record than most banks." He looked at her for a moment with that quiet, direct attention she was starting to recognize. "Yes," he said, "it is." That was the conversation Margaret Hollis witnessed through the front window on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, the information had reached Dora Simpth, who told her sister Ruth, who mentioned it to Reverend Paulson's wife at the Thursday prayer circle, where it was discussed with the particular combination of concern and relish that marked Willow Creek's most important social occasions. Clara heard about it the next morning. She heard about it because Dora Simpth's sister-in-law came in for a loaf of white bread and could not apparently stop herself from mentioning that people were talking. "I'm sure Mr. Callahan is just pleased with the supply arrangement," Clara said. "Of course," the woman said, in a tone that meant the opposite. Clara wrapped the bread, took the money, said goodbye, and waited until the woman was gone before she let out a long, slow breath. She had done everything right. She had been professional and appropriate, and she had given nobody any reason to talk, and they were talking anyway, because this was Willow Creek, and she was Clara Whitmore, and people in this town had been finding reasons to talk about her since before she had the vocabulary to understand what they were saying. She spent the next week being extremely careful. She kept her conversations with Ethan Callahan brisk and professional when he came in. She did not prolong them. She answered his questions efficiently and did not ask her own. When he lingered, she found reasons to move to the other side of the counter. She was polite. She was appropriate. She was miserable in a quiet way she refused to examine too closely. On a Wednesday evening when the bakery was closed and she was doing the week's accounts at the back table, someone knocked. She almost didn't answer, but the knock came again, 3 times deliberate, not urgent, but steady, and she found herself moving to the door. Ethan Callahan was standing on the boardwalk outside with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she couldn't quite categorize. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. "I could see the light was on." "It's fine." She stepped back automatically to let him in. "Is something wrong with the order?" "No." He came inside, and she noticed that he looked at the account book, open on the back table, and then looked away from it politely, which was a small thing, but the kind of small thing she noticed. "I wanted to ask you something." "All right." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I've been told by 3 separate people this week that I ought to reconsider my business arrangement with you," he said. Clara felt her stomach drop. "Have you?" she said. "Margaret Hollis, Frank Deaver at the feed store, and Reverend Paulson, who I will say approached the topic with considerably more scripture than either of the others." A pause. "The general message, as near as I could tell, was that you are not the sort of woman I should be seen doing regular business with." "I see." I wanted to ask you what you thought about that. She stared at him. Mr. Callahan. Ethan, he said. We've been doing business for 3 weeks, and you've called me Mr. Callahan every time, and I keep meaning to ask you to stop. Something shifted in her chest that she didn't have a name for. Ethan, she said. Why would you ask me what I think about it? Because it's about you, he said simply. Because you've been in this town a lot longer than I have, and you know these people, and I thought you might have something you wanted to say about it. She was quiet for a moment. What I think, she said finally, is that this town has been finding reasons to warn people away from me since I was 14 years old. And I think you should take that information and do with it what you think is right. I'm asking what you think is right. I think... She stopped. She started again. I think I am tired of spending my energy trying to manage other people's opinions of me. I think I've done nothing wrong. I think the supply arrangement is fair and professional, and I've held up my end of it. She met his eyes. And I think if you've decided to reconsider it because of what people are saying, that is completely your right, and I won't hold it against you. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. I haven't decided to reconsider it, he said. Then why are you here? Because I wanted to know if you were all right. He said it quietly, straightforwardly, as though it were the most obvious reason in the world. Because I've been watching this town treat you a particular way for 3 weeks, and I didn't think anyone was asking. Clara Whitmore had held herself together through a great many difficult things. She had held herself together through her father's death and 2 bad business years, and a dozen conversations that were designed specifically to make her feel worthless. She had gotten very good at it. She had built it into an art form, the specific internal architecture of a woman who had decided that if she was going to survive, she was going to survive with her dignity intact. And that meant she did not crack in front of people. She did not let them see her waver. She did not give anyone the satisfaction. She held herself together now. But it took considerably more effort than usual. I'm fine, she said. Okay. He didn't push it. He turned his hat in his hands once more, and then put it back on. I'll see you Friday for the pie order. I'll have it ready. He nodded and moved to the door. Miss Whitmore, he said. Clara, she said, and she had no idea why she said it. It just came out, and she felt her face go carefully still against whatever was happening underneath it. Ethan turned, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. Clara, he said. Good night. Good night, Ethan. He left. She stood in the middle of her bakery for a long time after, in the lamplight, with the account book open on the table and the warm smell of the day's bread still faint in the air. And she thought about a man who had heard 3 separate people warn him away from her in a single week, and had responded by coming to check if she was all right. She thought about that for a very long time. Then she closed the account book, turned down the lamp, and went upstairs to bed. She lay in the dark and told herself clearly and firmly that she was not going to build anything on this. That she was not going to let one man's decency undo the careful work of a dozen years. That she knew how this went. That she had lived in this town long enough to know that kindness had limits, and that warmth in private meant nothing if it didn't hold up in public. That she had been here before in different forms with different men, and she knew where it ended. She knew where it ended. She pressed her hand flat against the blanket and stared at the dark ceiling and reminded herself of every reason not to hope. And somewhere in the middle of that, she fell asleep. The following Friday, Ethan Callahan came in person to pick up the pie order instead of sending one of his men. He stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the credit system again, and about the mill in Helena, and about a disagreement she'd had with a supplier over the quality of late-season wheat. And somewhere in the middle of that, he mentioned that he'd grown up without a mother and learned to cook out of pure necessity. And she told him that she'd learned to bake because her mother had said it was the most honest work there was, that bread didn't lie to you. It either rose or it didn't. And you knew exactly where you stood. Ethan had looked at her with that quiet, serious attention when she said it. I've never heard it put that way, he said, but that's exactly right. She walked him out when he left. She didn't usually walk customers out. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride back down the main road, and she was aware with a clarity that was almost physical that she was in a significant amount of trouble. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lived in the space between a thing that had not happened yet and a thing that felt terrifyingly like it was going to. She folded her arms across herself and watched the road long after he'd gone out of sight, and thought about bread that didn't lie to you, and about a woman who had spent most of her life being told she wasn't worth choosing. And she thought about a man who came back, and came back again, and came back again. Not because he had to, not because of business, but because she was slowly and terrifyingly beginning to understand he wanted to. The question was what she was going to do about that. The question was whether after everything this town had said, and everything she had survived, and everything she had built her life around in the absence of being chosen, she was still capable of letting someone in. She didn't know the answer. She stood in her doorway in the late afternoon light of a Montana summer, with the smell of pie still warm around her, and the sound of the main road going about its business, and she genuinely did not know. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not immediately certain the answer was no. And that for Clara Whitmore was the most frightening thing that had happened to her in years. Clara told herself it was just business. She told herself that every morning for the next 2 weeks, standing at the oven before sunrise with her hands in the dough and her mind doing the thing she'd specifically instructed it not to do, which was, think about Ethan Callahan. She was not successful. The supply arrangement had settled into a rhythm. Thursdays for bread, Fridays for pies, and occasionally a special order when the ranch had extra men coming through for cattle work. It was clean. It was professional. It was exactly the kind of arrangement she'd had with a dozen other customers over the years, except that none of those customers had ever come in person when they could have sent a ranch hand, and none of them had ever stayed 2 hours past the point where the business portion of the conversation was finished. And none of them had ever looked at her the way Ethan Callahan looked at her, which was like she was saying something worth listening to. That was the part that undid her more than anything else. Not the courtesy, though, that was rare enough in Willow Creek. Not the directness, though she valued it. It was the listening. The specific quality of his attention when she spoke the way he didn't look around the room, or over her shoulder, or at the door the way people did when they were waiting for someone more interesting to arrive. He looked at her. He tracked what she said. He asked follow-up questions that proved he'd actually heard the thing she'd told him 5 minutes ago, which was such an uncommon experience that the first time it happened, she'd actually lost her train of thought mid-sentence and had to collect herself. She was not used to being heard. She was used to being tolerated. There was a difference, and the difference was the most dangerous thing she'd encountered in years. On a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the Friday conversation that had kept her awake longer than she was willing to admit, she was in the middle of her morning rush when the door opened and Ruth Deaver walked in. Ruth Deaver was Frank Deaver's wife, a thin, sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s who had made it her personal mission for the better part of a decade to serve as the primary transfer point for information in Willow Creek. She didn't gossip. She would have been offended by the word. She shared. She was a sharer. "Good morning, Clara." "Morning, Mrs. Deaver." Clara reached for the 2 rolls she already knew the woman was going to order. "The usual, please." Ruth set her purse on the counter. "I wanted to ask you something, woman to woman." There was that phrase again. "Of course," Clara said. "People are talking," Ruth said, dropping her voice to the register she reserved for serious conversations. "About you and Ethan Callahan." "People have been talking about me my entire life," Clara said pleasantly. "They're very dedicated." Ruth blinked. That wasn't the response she'd been prepared for. "I only mean," she said, recovering, "that it's becoming noticeable. Him coming in so often, staying so long. Frank says he saw the 2 of you standing outside the door for nearly 20 minutes last Friday." "We were discussing the fall supply schedule," Clara said. "It's a fairly complicated conversation." "Clara." Ruth leaned slightly forward. "I'm trying to help you, as a friend." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Deaver. A man like Callahan could have any woman in this county, any suitable woman, and I would hate to see you get hurt when he realizes—" She paused, choosing her words. "When he moves on to something more appropriate." Something more appropriate. Clara set the wrapped rolls on the counter and looked at Ruth Deaver with a steadiness that took everything she had. "I'll charge that to your account," she said. Ruth opened her mouth, then closed it. She took the rolls. She left. Clara turned back to her oven and stood there for a solid 30 seconds without moving, breathing through the particular burn that lived in her chest whenever this town reminded her of exactly what it thought she was worth. Then the door opened again and she turned around ready to be professional and pleasant and fine, and it was Ethan. Not Thursday, not Friday. Tuesday. He was already reading her face before she could rearrange it. "Bad morning," he said. "Fine morning," she said. "Can I help you with something?" He set his hat on the counter and looked at her. "Ruth Deaver just passed me on the boardwalk," he said. She had a particular look on her face. Mrs. Deaver always has a particular look on her face. Clara. The way he said her name had changed over the past few weeks. She didn't know exactly when it had happened, but it had moved from courtesy to something else. Something that landed slightly differently in her chest than words were supposed to. She was being helpful, Clara said. Apparently. What did she say? The usual. Clara began stacking the morning's unsold rolls into the display case with more attention than the task required. That you'll move on to something more appropriate. That I shouldn't misread the situation. A pause. Standard inventory for this town. And what do you think? Ethan said. I think I've heard it so many times it barely registers anymore. That's not what I asked. She stopped stacking rolls. Ethan, I'm asking what you think, he said. Not what the town thinks, not what Ruth Deaver thinks, what you think. She turned around and looked at him. There were approximately 4 feet of counter between them, and somehow it felt like the most significant distance she'd navigated in years. I think, she said carefully, that I have spent a very long time being careful. And I have been careful for good reasons. And I don't know what this is or what you mean by coming in here on a Tuesday, but I know that whatever it is, this town is watching, and this town has made up its mind about me before I ever opened my mouth, and whatever you're... She stopped, started again. I don't want to be an embarrassment to you. The words came out before she could decide whether she meant to say them. She meant to say them. She'd been thinking them for 2 weeks, and they were the most honest thing she could offer, and the most humiliating. And she held herself very still and waited for his response. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. An embarrassment, he said. That's the word people use, she said. Eventually. Who used it with you? She shook her head. It doesn't matter who. It matters, he said quietly, because whoever said that to you was wrong, and I'd like to know how long you've been carrying it. She didn't answer that. She couldn't answer that because the honest answer was, since I was 16 years old, and a boy I thought liked me, told his friends I was too much to be seen with, and she was not going to say that out loud in her own bakery on a Tuesday morning. Mr. Callahan, she said, retreating deliberately to the formal address building whatever small wall she could. I have a business to run. He picked up his hat. Thursday, he said. I'll be here Thursday. He left. And Clara stood behind her counter and felt simultaneously like she had done the right thing and like she had made a terrible mistake, which was the specific emotional combination that had defined most of her significant life decisions. Thursday came. He was there. He brought one of his ranch hands with him, a young man named Pete, who could not have been more than 20, and who looked around the bakery with the wide, uncomplicated appreciation of someone who hadn't eaten anything resembling a real meal in several days. Ethan introduced him, and Pete took his hat off immediately and said ma'am, with the earnest politeness of someone whose mother had drilled it into him, and Clara gave him a warm roll off the morning's batch and watched his entire face change. Lord above, Pete said reverently. Language, Ethan said. Sorry, ma'am, but that's the best thing I've eaten since February. Clara laughed. It came out before she thought about it, genuine and unguarded, the kind of laugh she didn't usually allow herself in public, and she watched Ethan Callahan hear it and go slightly, almost imperceptibly still. She looked away. She busied herself with the bread order. Pete chatted easily the way young men did when they were comfortable and well-fed, telling her about the ranch and the cattle drive coming up next month, and a horse that had gotten loose last week and ended up 3 miles east at a neighboring property. He was easy company, uncomplicated, and Clara found herself enjoying the conversation without the usual layer of calculation underneath it. Ethan said very little, but she was aware of him the whole time. The way you were aware of something that had weight that occupied space in a room in a way that changed the room slightly. When Pete stepped outside to wait with the horses, the silence settled between them with a particular quality. "He's a good hand," Ethan said. "He's a sweet kid. Don't tell him that. He's been practicing looking dangerous for 6 months. A beat. He talks about you, you know. The men do. Best food they've had in years, they say. They argue about whether to eat the pies the day they arrive or save them. What do they decide? They never save them." He looked at her steadily. "Clara, I want to ask you something and I'd like an honest answer." Her hands stilled on the bread wrapping. "All right," she said. "The other morning, when you talked about being an embarrassment." He paused. "Have I done something to make you think that's what I see when I look at you?" The question landed like a stone dropping into still water, and the ripples went outward in every direction before she could stop them. "No," she said. "Then where is it coming from?" "It's coming," she said slowly, "from 29 years of living in this town." He nodded, not dismissing it, taking it in. "That's fair," he said. "It is. And I'm not going to tell you to ignore it," he said, "because I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it would be honest. But I am going to tell you that what I see when I look at you is not what this town sees." She met his eyes. "What do you see?" she said. And she hadn't meant to ask it. She genuinely hadn't meant to ask it, but it came out anyway, in a voice slightly quieter than her normal one. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I see a woman who built something real," he said. "In hard circumstances, alone, without anyone making it easier for her. I see someone this town depends on, even if they don't have the grace to say so. I see a person who is smarter and more capable than half the business owners in this county, and who doesn't ask for recognition for any of it." He stopped. "And I see someone who has gotten so used to being told she's too much that she started saying it about herself before anyone else gets the chance." The silence afterward was the loudest thing she'd heard in years. "Ethan," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I'm not going to say anything," she said. "I'm just trying to—" She stopped. "I don't know what to do with you." Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. "That's all right," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." He took the bread order. He left. Clara put both hands on the counter and stood there for a full minute perfectly still, while something she had kept frozen for a very long time began terrifyingly to thaw. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Willow Creek had the observational capacity of a small but highly motivated intelligence network, and the developing situation between Clara Whitmore and Ethan Callahan had become its primary subject of study. People who had never been particularly interested in Clara's life were suddenly paying close attention. Women who had never spoken more than pleasantries to her began finding reasons to come into the bakery. Men who did business with Ethan found ways to mention her name in conversation and watch how he responded. What they were watching for, Clara knew, was the moment it fell apart. They expected it to fall apart. That was the thing she had to hold on to. The thing she forced herself to remember every time she felt the walls coming down slightly further than she'd intended. This town had already written the ending to her story. She was the woman it didn't work out for. She was the cautionary tale, the sad example, the woman who got ideas above her situation and paid for it. They were waiting for confirmation. And history, she reminded herself, was largely on their side. She had been 17 the first time a man had made her feel like she might be worth choosing. His name was James Whitfield, and he had come through Willow Creek with a supply train and spent 3 days buying bread from her and talking to her over the counter, and she had believed with the absolute conviction of 17 that something real was happening. On the 4th day, she had overheard him telling the supply train foreman that the baker girl was pleasant enough, but he'd never take a woman like that seriously, and she had gone home and learned for the first time the specific geometry of hope, followed by humiliation. She had been 23 the second time. A rancher's son from 2 towns over, decent enough, who had courted her quietly for 2 months before his mother came to the bakery personally to explain that her son deserved a wife who would be a credit to the family, and that she hoped Clara understood. Clara had understood. She had understood with great precision. She was not the kind of woman men chose when the choice was permanent. She was pleasant company. She was an interesting conversation. She was the woman men talked to when they wanted something real before going off to find something presentable. She knew the pattern. She had memorized it. So when Ethan Callahan walked into her bakery on a Saturday morning 2 days after their Thursday conversation with no business reason and no ranch hand with him, and simply a look of a man who had decided something, she knew she should be careful. She was careful. She was so careful. "You have a lot of free time for a ranch foreman," she said. "I finished early," he said. He sat down at the small table near the window, the one that got morning light, and she brought him coffee, because her hands moved before her brain weighed in, and he wrapped both hands around the cup the way he always did and looked at her. "Sit down, Clara. I have bread to shape. It'll wait 5 minutes." She sat down. She didn't know why she sat down. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want you to let me finish before you argue with me." "I don't argue. You argue constantly," he said with something that was almost a smile. "You're very polite about it, but you argue. You have an opinion about everything, and you generally wait until about halfway through my sentence to start forming your counter-argument." He looked at her. "So let me finish." She pressed her lips together. "All right. I grew up in Texas," he said. "My father had a small ranch, not prosperous, worked himself to an early grave trying to make it more than it was. My mother left when I was 8. I don't know where she went, and I stopped wondering about it a long time ago." He paused, turning the cup. "I have spent most of my adult life moving. Texas, Kansas, Missouri. Following the work, learning the territory, doing the job in front of me. I am good at moving on. It is possibly the thing I am best at." She watched him. "But I am 36 years old," he said, "and I am tired of it. And when I rode into Willow Creek 6 weeks ago looking for a resupply and walked into this bakery, I was not looking for anything except bread and a straightforward business arrangement." He looked up at her. "And then you told me that credit record was better than most banks, and I thought there is a woman who has been figuring things out without any help for a very long time." Clara was quiet. "I am not moving on," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in moving on. I bought the Callahan spread 2 years ago, and I intend to build something permanent here. And I am aware that this town has been in your ear for weeks about what I'm going to do, and I would like to directly contradict every single thing they've told you." She stared at him. She stared at him and felt her chest do something complicated that she had specifically, repeatedly, and emphatically instructed it not to do. "Ethan," she said, "I'm not finished. You said 5 minutes. I'm expanding my estimate." He held her gaze. "I know you've been hurt before. I don't need you to tell me about it, because I can see it in the way you brace yourself every time I walk in here, like you're waiting for the part where it goes wrong. I'm not going to pretend I can undo whatever put that there. But I can tell you that I am not here by accident, and I am not here out of pity, and I am not here because I haven't noticed what this town says about you." He stopped. "I'm here because of every reason this town thinks you're too much." She could not breathe. She was 29 years old, and she was sitting in her own bakery in the morning light, and she could not breathe. "That doesn't," she started. "Make sense," he said. "I was going to say it doesn't change anything. I know you were." He finished his coffee and set the cup down. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm not asking you to decide anything or feel anything you don't feel. I just wanted you to know where I stand because I think you've spent a long time assuming the worst, so you can be ready for it, and I wanted to give you something different to assume." He stood. He picked up his hat. "I'll be here Thursday," he said. He left. Clara sat at the table in the morning light with the coffee cups and the distant sound of the main road, and the specific silence of a woman whose entire internal architecture had just been significantly reorganized without her permission. She sat there for a long time. Then she went and shaped her bread, and she was so distracted that she shaped one loaf nearly twice the size it was supposed to be, and she noticed when she pulled it out of the oven and stood looking at it for a moment, and then thought irrelevantly that Ethan would probably say something about that. She caught herself thinking that. She stood with the oversized loaf in her hands and thought about the specific terror of caring what someone would say. And then she put the loaf down and went back to work and spent the rest of the day being very, very busy. The twist came on a Thursday, not Ethan's Thursday visit. Before that. Early morning before the bakery opened, when Clara was alone with her fire and her dough and the kind of quiet that let you hear footsteps on the boardwalk outside. She heard them. She heard two sets, slow and deliberate, stopping outside her door. Then she heard voices. "Can't let this continue." Margaret Hollis. Unmistakable. The man is serious, which is the problem. If he were just passing time, it would run its course. But Frank Deaver says Callahan bought that property with the intention of staying. I know. A man's voice. Henry Pruitt. She thought one of the older ranchers, the kind who sat on the town council and believed that constituted genuine authority. It's a question of appearances. Callahan is going to be an important man in this county. The last thing he needs is to be attached to her, Margaret finished. A pause. "She's a good baker," Pruitt said, which was apparently his one concession to generosity. "She is, and she can stay a baker. But there are lines, Henry. There are things a town like this can sustain and things it cannot." Clara stood absolutely still with her hands in the dough. "What are you suggesting?" Pruitt said. "I'm suggesting," Margaret said, and her voice had dropped to something quieter and more deliberate, "that someone needs to speak to Callahan directly. Not hints, not implications. Clearly. Tell him what kind of woman she is and what people will think, and what it will mean for his standing in this county if he continues down this road." Another pause. "And if he doesn't listen, then we make sure the circumstances do the speaking for us." Silence. Clara pulled her hands out of the dough. She stood in the center of her bakery and felt something that she recognized after a moment as clarity. Not the clarity of peace. The clarity of a woman who has just heard exactly how far people are willing to go and has decided quietly and completely that she is done being afraid of it. She washed her hands. She waited. When Ethan came in that afternoon, she was ready. "I need to tell you something," she said before he'd even settled his hat. He looked at her, and his attention sharpened immediately, the way it did when he recognized that something had shifted. "All right," he said. She told him. All of it. The voices outside the door, the words she'd heard, the specific phrase about circumstances doing the speaking. She told it plainly, without drama, the way you told someone information they needed. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me this," he said, "because you think I should walk away." "I'm telling you this," she said, "because I think you deserve to know what you're walking into, and because I'm done letting things happen to me without saying anything." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not telling you what to do." He looked at her for a long moment. "Did you hear who the man was?" he said. "Pruitt, I think." Ethan nodded slowly. "Henry Pruitt and I have a meeting scheduled next week," he said, "about grazing rights on the south quarter of the property. He's been friendly every time I've seen him." He said it without heat, but something underneath it had gone very still. "I appreciate you telling me. I thought you should know who was friendly." He looked at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "I should know exactly that." He left. And for the first time since any of this had started, Clara did not spend the rest of the day worrying about what he would decide. She spent it wondering instead what she would decide. Because she was beginning to understand something that this town had never given her credit for understanding. She had always had a choice. She had always had a say in her own life. She had simply spent so long being told that her choices didn't matter, and her say wouldn't count, and her hopes were too large for her situation that she had started somewhere along the way to believe it. She was done believing it. She didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't know what came next, or how it would go, or whether Ethan Callahan was going to withstand whatever Margaret Hollis and Henry Pruitt had planned. She didn't know if she was capable of letting herself be chosen, really chosen, after all the years of the opposite. But she knew this. She was not going to make herself smaller to make this easier for anyone. She was not going to step back from her counter and lower her eyes and pretend she didn't notice what was happening the way she had pretended for 29 years, the way this town had trained her to pretend. Clara Whitmore closed her bakery that evening and walked upstairs with something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, not certainty, something harder than both. She had a business to run. She had bread to bake in the morning and a supply order to fill, and 2 families on credit who needed what she provided. She had a life that was hers, and she was going to protect it. The meeting between Ethan Callahan and Henry Pruitt happened on a Tuesday. Clara knew because Pete told her. Pete had developed a habit of stopping by the bakery on mornings when he was in town for supplies, ostensibly for coffee actually, because he'd discovered that Clara kept a tin of cinnamon rolls behind the counter that she sold at half price when they were a day old, and Pete had correctly identified this as one of the better deals available in Willow Creek. He was 20 years old and straightforward in the way that young men were before life complicated them, and he talked about the ranch, the way people talked about things they genuinely loved, with detail and specificity and no particular agenda. "Mr. Callahan was in a mood yesterday," Pete said, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. "After the Pruitt meeting." Clara kept her hands moving on the dough. "What kind of mood?" "Quiet," Pete said. "Quieter than usual, which for him is pretty quiet." He considered. "He didn't say what happened. Just came back, went straight to the barn, worked through supper." "That's not necessarily about the meeting," Clara said. "No, ma'am." Pete looked at her with the frank directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften things. "But Jimmy, that's our oldest hand, been with the Callahan family 15 years. Jimmy says that's the face Mr. Callahan gets when somebody's tried to tell him what to do." Clara said nothing. "Jimmy says the last man who tried that was a cattle broker in Kansas City," Pete added. "Ended up losing the Callahan contract, and about 4 others when word got around." "Pete," Clara said. "Ma'am." "Finish your coffee." He grinned and finished his coffee, and she sent him off with 2 cinnamon rolls wrapped in cloth, and she stood at her counter after he left and processed the information with the careful attention she gave to anything that mattered. Pruitt had said something at that meeting. She didn't need to know the exact words. She knew the shape of it, the particular combination of authority and implication that men like Henry Pruitt used when they wanted to communicate a position without making it an explicit threat. She had watched that approach her whole life, directed at her, directed at anyone in Willow Creek who occupied a position the town's established order found inconvenient. The question was what Ethan had said back. She found out the next morning. She was arranging the window display when she heard boots on the boardwalk, and then the door opened, and it was Ethan, and he was carrying something she didn't immediately recognize. It took her a moment to realize it was a crate of apples. "From the Henderson place," he said, setting it on the counter. "They've got more than they can use, and Henderson asked if you could take them. He said you'd understand the arrangement." Clara looked at the apples. "The Henderson family is on my credit account." "I know. He mentioned that." Ethan straightened. "He also said you were the only person in Willow Creek who helped them last winter when the youngest boy got sick and they couldn't work the orchard." "I gave them bread," Clara said. "That's not extraordinary." "It is when nobody else did." He looked at her steadily. "I met with Pruitt yesterday." "I heard." Something moved briefly in his expression. Pete is not a subtle young man." "No, he is not. Ethan leaned against the counter. Pruitt told me that my association with you was a concern for certain members of the community. That for a man trying to establish himself in the county reputation was a significant asset. That he hoped I understood what he was saying. Clara kept her face still. And did you? I told him I understood perfectly, Ethan said, and that if the reputation of a man in this county depended on how he treated a woman who had run a business alone for 15 years and fed half the town through 2 bad winters, then the reputation wasn't worth protecting. He paused. He didn't love that. No, Clara said carefully. I imagine he didn't. He said some other things. His voice stayed level. About you specifically. About your appearance. About what kind of woman you were. Another pause, and she could see something underneath the levelness that was less calm than it appeared. I won't repeat them. You don't need to, she said. I've heard them. I know you have. He said it quietly, and the quiet of it was different from his usual quiet, heavier. That's the part I keep thinking about. That you've heard all of it for years, and you still get up before sunrise and build that fire and make the bread and open the door. He looked at her. That's not nothing, Clara. She pressed her hands flat against the counter. What did you say to him? She asked. At the end, I told him the grazing rights discussion was concluded and that I didn't think we'd have much further business. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly. He'll make things difficult. Men like that have long memories and short tolerance for being contradicted. I know. I know you know. He straightened. I wanted you to hear it from me. Whatever comes next, it's not because of anything you did. It's because he said something about you that I wasn't willing to sit across a table and listen to. Clara stared at him. You ended a business relationship, she said. Over something someone said about me. Yes. Ethan, that will cost you. Probably. Pruitt has connections with every major rancher in the South County. If he decides to make it his business to... Clara. His voice was patient and certain. I have made difficult men unhappy before. I know how to manage it. A beat. What I am less experienced with is telling a woman that I ended a business meeting because someone insulted her and then watching her spend the next 10 minutes worrying about whether I can handle the consequences. She stopped. She looked at him. He looked back with that straight, unhurried attention. Thank you, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. You're welcome, he said simply. He picked up his hat. I'll need the regular order Thursday. It'll be ready. He left. Clara picked up one of Henderson's apples and held it in her hands and thought about a man who had sat across a table from Henry Pruitt and said no. She had not in 29 years had anyone sit across a table from Henry Pruitt and say no on her behalf. She didn't know what to do with it. She genuinely didn't know, and that uncertainty was itself a kind of information, because she had navigated most of her life with a clear internal compass that told her exactly what to do, and in this particular situation, the compass was just spinning. She put the apple down and went back to work, because the bread didn't care what she was feeling, which was honestly one of the things she loved most about bread. The trouble started the following week. It started quietly, the way the worst kinds of trouble did in small things that were easy to explain individually and only made sense when you looked at them together. First, the mill in Helena sent the wrong grade of flour. Not catastrophically wrong, just lower quality than her usual order. And when she wrote to dispute it, the response came back slow and unsatisfying, with a reference to a supposed change in her account status that she had never authorized. Then the Morrison family, who had been regular customers for 4 years, stopped coming in. Clara asked about it carefully through channels she trusted and got back a vague story about Mrs. Morrison preferring to buy from a different supplier now. Clara had no other supplier to speak of. The message was the message. Then Frank Deaver declined to renew her supply credit at the dry goods store. She went to him directly. Frank Deaver was a compact, practical man who had always been pleasant enough with her without ever being what she would call an ally. He sat behind his counter and looked at her with the expression of someone who was uncomfortable but had decided to hold his position anyway. It's a business decision, Clara, he said. You've extended me credit for 6 years, Frank. Things change. What's changed? He didn't answer that. She looked at him for a long moment. Is this Pruitt? She said. He shifted. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. She kept her voice level. I think Henry Pruitt has been making calls, and I think you are afraid of what it costs you to say no to him, and I understand that because I have spent my whole life in this town understanding what things cost. She paused. But I want you to look me in the face and tell me this is a business decision. Frank Deaver looked at his counter. He didn't say anything, which was in its own way the most honest thing she'd gotten from him in 6 years. She left. She walked back down the main road and past her bakery without going in because she needed a minute, and she walked to the end of the block and stood there and thought very clearly about what was happening. Pruitt was moving. He was doing it the way men like that always did, through existing systems, through credit and commerce, and the quiet withdrawal of small supports, each one deniable in isolation, unmistakable in aggregate. He wasn't going to do anything dramatic. He was simply going to make her position in this town more difficult until she became, in the practical sense, a liability that Ethan couldn't afford. He was going to try to do to her what he'd always done. Make her too expensive to love. She stood at the end of the boardwalk, and she felt the old fear move through her, the one she'd been carrying since she was 14. The one that said, "This is what happens to women like you. This is the ceiling. This is where it stops." She felt it. And then she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She got angry. Not the quiet, managed frustration she usually allowed herself. Real anger. The kind that was hot and clear and organized itself very quickly into something that looked less like emotion and more like a plan. She turned around and walked back to her bakery. She opened the door and went to the back table and sat down with paper and a pencil and wrote down every family in Willow Creek that bought from her on credit. 12 families. She wrote down the flour she would need for the next month and calculated how much of it she could source outside of Deaver's store, from alternate suppliers she'd identified when she was renegotiating 2 years ago, but hadn't needed to use. She wrote down the names of the ranchers she'd supplied who were not in Pruitt's circle. 4 of them men who valued her bread and her reliability over county politics. She wrote down everything. She was halfway through her calculations when the door opened without a knock. She looked up. It was Margaret Hollis. Margaret came in with the particular energy of someone who believed she was on a mercy mission, which Clara had learned to recognize as one of the more dangerous states a person could be in. "I heard about Frank Deaver," Margaret said. "News travels," Clara said. She didn't put down her pencil. "I want to help," Margaret said. Clara looked at her. "I want to speak plainly," Margaret continued, settling herself into the chair across the table as though she'd been invited. "This situation has gotten out of hand. I warned you early on that Callahan would cause problems, and I was right, though I didn't anticipate exactly this form." "You warned me," Clara said, "that I should stay in my place." Margaret's mouth pressed thin. "I warned you to be realistic." "About what kind of woman I am. About how the world works, Clara. About what men like Callahan ultimately do and don't." "He ended a business relationship with Henry Pruitt," Clara said, "because of something Pruitt said about me. Does that match your expectations about what men like Callahan do?" A pause. "That's what I'm trying to tell you," Margaret said, and her voice shifted slightly toward something that might in another light have been genuine. "That's exactly what frightens me about this. He's serious, and serious men who make enemies on behalf of women like—" She stopped. "Women like me," Clara said. Margaret sat back. "I have known you since you were 14 years old," she said quietly. "And I have watched this town be unkind to you. I am aware of it. I am not entirely without—" She paused again. "I don't want to see you get hurt when this falls apart. Because it will fall apart. Things like this always do. Because of women like me," Clara said. "Or because of men like Pruitt." Margaret didn't answer. "Margaret," Clara said, and she set her pencil down and looked at the older woman directly. "I have heard you say, woman to me, 5 times in my life. Every single time what followed was an instruction to expect less, to settle for less, to want less." She kept her voice steady. "I am asking you genuinely, woman to woman, have I ever given you any reason to believe I am incapable of surviving a difficult outcome?" Silence. "No," Margaret said finally. It came out quietly. "Then stop coming here to help me survive," Clara said, "and start asking yourself whether you want to help me fight." Margaret stared at her. She left without answering. But she didn't look the same going out as she had coming in. The next 3 days were the hardest ones. Pruitt moved faster than she'd expected. The mill in Helena canceled her account entirely, citing an administrative irregularity that didn't exist. 2 of the families on her credit list sent word that they wouldn't be needing bread for the foreseeable future. The youngest Garrett boy, who sometimes helped her carry supplies on delivery days, told her with obvious embarrassment that his father had said he couldn't come around anymore. She kept the bakery open. She rebuilt what she could with what she had. She wrote to the alternate flour supplier in Billings and got a response within the week, slower than Helena, but not prohibitively so. She adjusted her prices marginally, not enough to hurt her credit customers, enough to stabilize the math. She worked longer hours and said nothing about it, and did not under any circumstances allow anyone to see her afraid. She was afraid. She lay awake 3 nights running and ran the numbers in her head and calculated how long she could hold without the Helena contract and whether the Billings supplier would come through and what she would do if 2 more of her regular accounts pulled out. The numbers were not comfortable, but they were not impossible. And that was what she held on to. Ethan found out on a Thursday. He came for the regular order and looked at her face and said with no preamble whatsoever what happened. Not a question, a statement. The statement of a man who already knew something had happened and was waiting to find out the shape of it. She told him. She told it cleanly, the mill cancellation. Deaver's credit the families who'd stopped coming. She told it without asking him to fix it, because she was not asking him to fix it. She was informing him of the situation, the same way she'd informed him about the conversation she'd overheard outside her door. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "He moved faster than I thought he would," Ethan said. "I underestimated it too." "How long can you hold?" She appreciated that he asked it that way. "Not can you hold. How long?" 3 months if nothing else changes," she said. "Maybe 4 if Billings comes through." "Billings will come through," he said. "I know the owner. I'll write to him today." He met her eyes. "And I want to move the ranch supply budget to cover the next 6 months in advance, paid tomorrow." She stared at him. "Ethan." "It's a business decision," he said. "I need reliable supply for the ranch, and I intend to ensure it." "It's not just a business decision, and you know it." "It's both," he said steadily. "The business reason is real. The other reason is also real. I'm not going to pretend it's only one of them." She was quiet. "People will say you're propping me up," she said. "They'll say I can't survive without you. People who've been trying to tear down what you built for 29 years don't get to have opinions about what survival looks like," he said. "And you will be surviving. The money is a bridge, not a foundation. The foundation is already there. You built it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know how to let people help me," she said. It came out more honest than she'd intended, and she felt exposed by it, but she didn't take it back. "I know," he said. "I've noticed. Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been watching." He paused. "Clara, letting someone help you is not the same as needing them to survive. You already know the difference. You've been the one doing the helping for 15 years. Something shifted in her chest that she recognized this time. She recognized it, and she did not tell it to stop. "All right," she said. He nodded. He started to pick up the bread order, and then he stopped, and there was a moment where the morning light came through the bakery window, and the main road was going about its business outside, and everything felt suspended. "There's something else," he said. His voice had changed slightly. She noticed. "What is it?" He set the bread order back down. "I got a letter yesterday," he said. "From a ranch operation in Colorado. Larger spread than mine, better water, more established. They're looking for a foreman who can run the whole thing." He paused. "The money is significant. More than I'm making here, more than I expect to make here for several years." Clara felt the bottom of something drop away. "That's a serious offer," she said. Her voice came out perfectly steady. She had a lot of practice with perfectly steady. "It is. When do they need an answer?" 3 weeks. She picked up the ledger from beside the counter and opened it to nothing in particular. "You should consider it seriously," she said. "I've already considered it seriously," he said. "I turned it down this morning." She looked up. "I wrote the letter before I came here," he said, holding her gaze, "because I wanted you to know that this wasn't a choice I needed to think about. And I wanted you to hear it before I told you about the offer, so you couldn't spend any time wondering." Clara stood behind her counter and looked at a man who had turned down a significant offer and then come to tell her in the same breath so she wouldn't be afraid. "You're making it very difficult," she said quietly, "to keep my walls up." "Good," he said. "I've had those walls for a long time. I know. They've kept me functional." "They've kept you safe," he said. "There's a difference. And you know there is." She did know. She had always known. She just hadn't had a reason before to do anything about it. She looked at him across the counter, across 15 years of careful management and deliberate distance, and every lesson this town had ever taught her about what happened to women like her when they wanted too much. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not frightened," she said. "I know. And I'm not going to let anyone make decisions for me. Not Pruitt. Not Margaret Hollis. Not you. I wouldn't ask you to. And if this goes wrong—" "It might," he said. "Most things might. That's not a reason." She was quiet. Outside, the main road moved. Someone's horse shook its head at a fly. A wagon rolled past 2 kids hanging off the back. Willow Creek going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that something was happening inside this bakery that was not ordinary at all. "Thursday," she said finally. "Thursday," he agreed. "Come for the bread order." She met his eyes. "And stay for coffee." Something moved across his face that was unmistakably relief. "I will," he said. He picked up the bread order and left, and this time, when Clara stood in her bakery after he'd gone, she didn't argue with what she was feeling. She let it be there. She let it be there, and she went back to work, and she was thinking about the numbers in her ledger and the billing supplier, and what she was going to do about Deaver's account, and underneath all of it, quieter than everything else, was the specific warmth of a woman who had spent a very long time closing doors and had finally left one open. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know whether Pruitt had more moves to make, or whether Margaret Hollis would land on the right side of things, or whether the town of Willow Creek was capable of seeing her clearly after 29 years of the alternative. What she knew was this: she had survived everything this town had thrown at her. She had survived it alone. Whatever came next, she was not going to be surviving it alone. And Henry Pruitt, she thought, setting her pencil back to her ledger with a steadiness that surprised even her, had made a significant miscalculation. He had thought that isolating her would make her smaller. He had not accounted for what happened to a woman who had spent her whole life making something out of nothing when you gave her one good reason to stop holding back. She was going to be a great deal more than he'd bargained for. She was entirely certain of it. The letter from Billings arrived on a Monday. Clara read it twice, standing at the back table, then set it down and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. The Billings supplier would take her account. Better grade flour than Helena had been providing in the final month's comparable price, and a credit arrangement she could work with. The letter was signed by a man named Garrett Cooper, and at the bottom in different handwriting, someone had added a single line: "Ethan Callahan speaks well of you. That's enough for us." She stood there for a long moment with that line. Then she folded the letter, put it in the tin box where she kept the important papers, and started the morning fire. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not going to start over a business letter, even one that had the particular quality of a door opening after a very long time of finding them locked. But she held the warmth of it, the way you held something fragile, carefully aware that it was real. Ethan came in that Thursday. He knew before she said anything. She could tell by the way he looked at her the slight shift in his expression that she'd learned to read over the past weeks, the one that meant he was assessing, checking, making sure. "Billings came through," she said. "Good. Simple. No fanfare." "You wrote to them," she said. "I mentioned you, yes." "You didn't tell me you were going to do that. I thought it might work better if I did it before you could argue with me about it." He sat down at the counter and she poured his coffee without being asked, which she noticed, and he noticed her noticing, and neither of them said anything about it. "How are the numbers?" "Better," she said. "Not comfortable yet, but better." "Pruitt pulled back this week," Ethan said. "I don't know if you've noticed." She had noticed. 3 of the families who'd stopped coming in had quietly returned. No explanation offered, none asked for. They came in, they bought their bread, they paid, and Clara treated them exactly as she always had, because she was not interested in making people pay for changing their minds in the right direction. "Why did he pull back?" she said. Ethan turned his coffee cup. "Because I had a conversation with James Whitfield." She went still. James Whitfield was not a man whose name she heard often. He was the largest single landowner in the county, a man who had been ranching in Montana since before Willow Creek existed as a town, and who sat entirely outside the social networks that Margaret Hollis and Henry Pruitt operated in, not because he was excluded from them, but because he found them uninteresting. He was in his late 60s, rarely came to town, and had a reputation for making exactly one assessment of a person and sticking to it for life. "You know James Whitfield," she said. "He bought cattle from a Kansas operation I worked with 6 years ago," Ethan said. "We've kept in touch. I wrote to him when Pruitt started moving against you because Whitfield has known Pruitt for 30 years, and I thought he might have a perspective." "What kind of perspective?" "The kind that involves knowing that Pruitt has been using his position on the County Land Commission to favor his own water rights applications for the past decade." Ethan looked at her steadily. "Whitfield has been watching it for years and waiting for the right moment. He considers the situation with you to be Pruitt overreaching badly enough to give him that moment." Clara stared at him. "Henry Pruitt is being investigated. Not yet. But Whitfield is talking to the Territorial Land Office next month." A pause. "Pruitt doesn't know that yet, but he knows Whitfield wrote to him last week suggesting he find more productive uses for his time than pressuring local business owners." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happened when something you'd been braced against turned out to be smaller than you'd feared and your body had to recalibrate. "You did all of this," Clara said slowly. "Whitfield did most of it." "Because you wrote to him." "Yes." "Ethan." She looked at him. "You have been quietly—" She stopped searching for the word. "Managing things," he offered. "I was going to say fighting," she said. "In ways I didn't know about." He was quiet for a moment. "You were handling the front of it," he said. "You kept the bakery open. You found the billing supplier. You rebuilt the customer relationships. You did the visible work." He met her eyes. "I did the part you didn't see. That's not managing you. That's being on your side." She had to look away. She looked at the window, and at the main road outside, and at the ordinary morning life of Willow Creek passing by, and she thought about what it meant to have someone on your side who didn't need to be seen doing it. "I've never had that before," she said. It came out very quiet. "I know," he said. "I don't know how to—" She stopped. "You don't have to know how," he said. "You just have to let it be real." She looked back at him. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle it got around 9 o'clock, and Ethan Callahan was sitting at her counter with his hands around a coffee cup, looking at her with an expression she had stopped trying to categorize because every category she had was too small for it. "I'm going to need some time," she said. "I have time. I'm not easy," she said. "I know you think you know what that means, but I'm telling you directly. I have opinions about everything, and I will argue with you, and I don't like being managed, and I've been making every decision alone for 15 years, and I don't know how to stop doing that." "Good," Ethan said. She blinked. "Good. I don't want someone who doesn't have opinions. I work with enough people who say yes to everything. It's exhausting." He looked at her with absolute seriousness. "Clara, I know who you are. I've been paying attention." She pressed her lips together against whatever was trying to happen in her face. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. He finished his coffee. He picked up the bread order. He settled his hat. "Sunday," he said. "What about Sunday? I'd like to take you to supper at the hotel dining room, not for business." He met her eyes. "I want this town to see us have supper together, not because I need to make a point, but because I'm tired of only talking to you in your bakery, and I think you deserve to eat a meal someone else cooked for once." She looked at him for a moment. "The whole town will talk," she said. "The whole town is already talking," he said. "We might as well give them something accurate to say." For the first time in the entire conversation, Clara Whitmore laughed, not the careful managed version she used in public, the real one. "Sunday," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him do it fully, without qualification, and it changed his whole face in a way that she was going to be thinking about for the rest of the day, whether she wanted to or not. "Sunday," he said. He left. Clara stood behind her counter in the morning light and let herself feel exactly what she was feeling without arguing with any of it, which was new and uncomfortable and the best she'd felt in years. Word got around about Sunday supper before Sunday arrived. Of course it did. This was Willow Creek. Clara heard about it through Pete, who had apparently told half the bunkhouse, who had apparently told various people in town during the weekly supply run. She was not surprised. She had made peace with the fact that nothing in her life was going to be private in this town, and had decided somewhere in the days since Ethan's Thursday visit that she no longer particularly cared. That was the change, she thought. That was what was different. It wasn't that the opinions had stopped. It wasn't that the town had transformed, or that Margaret Hollis had suddenly found grace, or that Henry Pruitt had packed up and left. All of those things were exactly as they had always been. What was different was that she had stopped organizing her life around them. She still heard every comment. She still caught the looks. She still walked into the dry goods store and watched Frank Deaver's face go careful in the particular way it did now when he saw her, a mixture of guilt and self-justification that he hadn't figured out how to resolve. But it no longer felt like weight she had to carry. It felt like weather. Present, sometimes unpleasant, not within her control, not her responsibility to fix. Saturday morning, Margaret Hollis came in. Clara had been expecting this. The supper was tomorrow, and Margaret had never once in her life allowed a significant social development to occur in Willow Creek without weighing in on it first. "I'll take the usual," Margaret said. Clara started wrapping the rye loaf. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said. Clara's hand stopped. She looked up. Margaret Hollis was standing at the counter with her gloved hands folded in front of her, and her expression doing something complicated, like a woman who had rehearsed a speech and then decided at the last moment to say something true instead. "I have been coming into this bakery for 15 years, Margaret said. "And I have given you advice on what to expect from your life that was based on what I believed the world was willing to offer a woman in your position." She paused. "I was wrong about what you deserved, and I used the word realistic when I meant something that was not kind." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I'm not sure what to do with that," she said. "You don't have to do anything with it," Margaret said. "I'm not asking for anything. I just—" She stopped. "I heard what you said to me, about woman to woman. And I've been thinking about it. Which part? The part about helping you fight. Margaret's jaw was set, but her eyes were different from usual. I spoke to Reverend Paulson's wife yesterday, and Dora Simth. I told them that I believed this town had been unkind to you in ways that reflect poorly on all of us, and that I would consider it a personal affront if anyone attempted to make your supper tomorrow into something unpleasant. Clara stared at her. You threatened them, Clara said. I expressed my position clearly, Margaret said with great dignity. Clara looked at this woman, this complicated, frustrating, surprisingly complicated woman who had been a weight on her chest for 15 years and had just in her own stiff and imperfect way tried to lift some of it. Thank you, Clara said. Margaret. The first name surprised them both. Margaret picked up the rye loaf and her purse and walked to the door, and then she paused. He's a good man, she said without turning around. Callahan, I can admit that. He's a good man and he sees you clearly, and I was afraid of what that meant instead of glad for it. She pushed the door open. I'm glad for it now. She left. Clara stood in the sudden quiet of the bakery and felt the specific sensation of a long-held tension releasing not all at once, but enough a loosening in things she'd held tight for so long she'd forgotten they were clenched. She went back to work. Sunday came. Clara put on her best dress, the deep blue wool one she'd made herself 3 years ago and worn exactly twice since. She pinned her hair up properly, not the quick working pin she used every morning, but carefully. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and thought about all the mornings she'd looked in that mirror and recited the list of what was wrong, the way the town's opinions had become her own internal voice over the years, relentless and familiar. She thought about a man who had said he saw exactly enough. She stopped reciting the list. She walked down the stairs and out the bakery door and down the main road to the hotel dining room, and Ethan was already there standing outside, and he saw her coming, and he didn't do anything dramatic. He didn't make a show of it. He just looked at her with that steady attention and said, You look wonderful, Clara. Like it was a plain fact that didn't require ceremony. Thank you, she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked into the hotel dining room together, and the dining room did what she'd known it would do, which was notice. Every head that wasn't already turned. Every conversation paused for one beat too long. She felt it the way you felt weather present noted, moving on. She sat down across from Ethan Callahan in the hotel dining room and picked up the menu and said, I've heard the roast beef here is better than the chicken. Good to know, he said. The pie is not better than mine. Nothing is better than yours. That is objectively true, she said. And he laughed, and she heard it properly for the first time. Not the almost smile she'd been getting for weeks, but the real thing, and it was a good sound, the kind that sat warm in the room after it was gone. They had supper. It lasted 2 hours. They talked about the ranch and the bakery and the Billings contract and a book she'd been reading that he'd read 3 years earlier and disagreed with her about, which turned into the most entertaining argument she'd had in years. They talked about his years moving across the frontier and her years rooted in one place, and whether roots were a choice or a necessity, or just what happened when you found something worth staying for. I used to think staying was settling, he said. That moving was ambition. And now I think I was confusing motion with purpose. He looked at her. I've been more purposeful in the last 2 months than in the previous 5 years. She looked at her plate and then back up at him. That's a significant thing to say, she said. It's a significant thing to mean, he said. She held that for a moment. Ethan, she said, I need to ask you something directly. All right. What do you want? She said. Not what you're not looking for, not what you're willing to deal with. What do you actually want? From this. She gestured between them, small gesture, precise. He didn't hesitate. I want to court you properly, he said. I want to have supper again somewhere other than your bakery, and I want to take you to the autumn social in October, and I want this town to run out of things to say, because we've been so consistent there's nothing left to speculate about. He paused. And eventually, not tomorrow, not next month, when you're ready, if you ever are, I want to ask you something important. She looked at him across the table in the hotel dining room in Willow Creek, Montana, with the whole town's awareness of them sitting in the air around the table like something visible. She thought about 14-year-old Clara, alone in the bakery, learning that alone was the safest position. She thought about 23-year-old Clara, listening to a woman explain why she wasn't suitable. She thought about every morning she'd gotten up before the sun and built the fire and done the work and kept the walls up and told herself this was enough, this was fine. This was what her life was going to be, and she was going to be grateful for it. She thought about what Ethan had said about the difference between safe and functional. "Court me properly," she said. "Yes." Which means, what exactly to a man who spent a decade moving across the frontier? It means I show up, he said, consistently, publicly, without apology. His voice was steady and certain in the way it was when he'd made up his mind about something. It means I am not a secret, and you are not something I'm managing. And if Henry Pruitt has an opinion about it, he can share it with the Territorial Land Office when Whitfield's investigation comes through. She pressed her lips together against the laugh. "That's a very specific form of courtship," she said. "I'm a specific man." She looked at him. She thought about bread that didn't lie to you, that either rose or it didn't, and you knew exactly where you stood. "All right," she said. Something in his whole body settled slightly, the way a man settled when something he'd been holding steady finally had ground under it. "All right," he said. They walked back down the main road after supper, and people saw them and people talked, and Clara Whitmore walked with her chin up, and Ethan Callahan walked beside her, and neither of them said anything about the looks or the pauses in conversation as they passed. At the bakery door she stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For supper." "Thank you for the company." He tipped his hat. "I'll be here Thursday." "You're always here Thursday," she said. "I'll be here Thursday," he said, with intent. She smiled. She let him see it, the full version unguarded, and watched what it did to his expression. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Clara." She went inside. She stood in the dark bakery and listened to his footsteps go down the boardwalk, and she thought about the word intent, and she thought about the word consistently, and she thought about a man who had turned down a job offer in Colorado without a day's deliberation. She thought about the autumn social in October. She thought about eventually. She stood in the dark a long time. Then she went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and did something she had not done in so long that the feeling was almost unfamiliar. She let herself want something. Not carefully. Not with the usual architecture of qualifications and protections and maybe if things go right, but probably they won't, that she'd been wrapping her hopes in since she was 16 years old. Just plainly, clearly, without apology. She wanted this. She wanted Thursday with intent and the autumn social and the important question that was somewhere out in the future. And she wanted to keep arguing about books with a man who disagreed with her and who listened when she spoke and who had sat across from Henry Pruitt and said no without a second thought. She wanted to stop surviving and start living. She lay down in the dark and thought that was the truest thing she'd understood about herself in a very long time. Outside Willow Creek went about its night business. Somewhere down the road someone was playing a fiddle. The October wind was starting to move through the first cold edge of it, the kind that said winter was thinking about coming. Clara Whitmore pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. She was not afraid. For the first time, in as long as she could remember, the future was something she was moving toward instead of bracing against, and that she thought was everything. October came to Willow Creek the way it always did without asking permission. The air changed first, then the quality of the light, then the particular mood of a town that had spent a summer talking about Clara Whitmore and Ethan Callahan, and had arrived at autumn with the peculiar deflation of people whose predictions had not come true on schedule. They had expected it to fall apart by August. August came and went. Ethan was at the bakery every Thursday, every Friday, and increasingly on days that had no business justification whatsoever. He came Tuesday for coffee and to argue about the book she'd finished. He came Saturday to help her move a flower delivery when the boy she usually hired had taken sick. He came on a Wednesday evening with no explanation at all, sat at the small table near the window, drank 2 cups of coffee, and left after an hour looking like a man who had exactly what he needed. Willow Creek adjusted its timeline. September, they said. Surely by September. September passed. Now it was October, and the autumn social was 2 weeks away, and the town had stopped predicting and started in the grudging and mostly silent way of communities that have been wrong about something for long enough accepting. Not all of them. Henry Pruitt's name still came up, though less frequently, and always with the slightly lowered voice of someone aware that the situation had not gone the way Pruitt had intended. James Whitfield's letter to the Territorial Land Office had apparently set something in motion that Pruitt was now occupied managing, and occupied men had less time for orchestrating social pressure campaigns against bakery owners. Frank Deaver had reinstated Clara's credit account in September. He'd come in on a Tuesday morning, sat down at the counter without being invited, and said, "I'd like to discuss resuming the arrangement we had before." Clara had looked at him. "Why?" she said. Frank had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Because it was the right arrangement, and I let myself get pushed into ending it for the wrong reasons. And Pruitt's situation has nothing to do with your timing." He'd been quiet for a moment. "It may have helped me see the situation more clearly." She'd thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "The terms are the same as before," she said. "I don't renegotiate when circumstances change in my favor any more than I did when they changed against me." "That's fair," Frank said. "It is." Clara agreed, and had gone back to work. She told Ethan about it that Thursday, and he'd listened with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered, and at the end, he'd said, "You didn't make it easy for him." "Should I have?" "No." He looked at her. "That's what I said. You didn't make it easy, and you didn't make it impossible. That's exactly right." She had thought about that for a while afterward, about the difference between holding people accountable and holding them permanently, about what forgiveness looked like when it wasn't the same as forgetting. She was still thinking about it on the Thursday, 2 weeks before the autumn social, when Ethan came in with his usual Thursday directness and said without sitting down, "I need to ask you something." She looked up from the bread she was wrapping. "About the social," he said. "I assumed you'd be asking eventually." "I want to take you," he said, "which you already know, but I want to be clear about what I mean by it before I do." He set his hat on the counter. "In this county, taking a woman to the autumn social is a public statement. People understand what it means." "People in this town understand everything," Clara said, "whether you intend them to or not. This time, I intend them to." He looked at her steadily. "I want them to know. Not because I need to make a point at Pruitt, or because I want to give Margaret Hollis something to process. Because you deserve to walk into a room and have it be clear that you are not alone." He paused. "That you have not been alone for a while now." Clara set down the wrapped loaf. "You keep saying things," she said, "that I don't know what to do with." "I know. I'm getting better at it," she said. "At not knowing what to do with them and letting them be true anyway." Something warm moved through his expression. "Is that yes?" he said. "That is yes," she said. He picked up his hat. He was almost at the door when she said, "Ethan." He turned. "You said eventually," she said. "Back at supper. You said eventually you wanted to ask me something important." She held his gaze. "How far away is eventually?" He looked at her for a moment. "That depends," he said, "on how the social goes." He left. Clara stood in her bakery with both hands resting on the counter and felt the specific exhilaration of a woman who had spent her whole life expecting the floor to drop out and was beginning genuinely to believe it might hold. The night of the autumn social arrived with a cold snap that had been threatening all week. Clara wore the blue wool dress again, the one she'd made herself, because she had looked at it in the wardrobe and thought it was the most herself she had, and if there was ever a night to be exactly herself, it was this one. She pinned her hair up properly and stood at the small mirror and did not recite the list. She hadn't recited the list in 3 weeks. She was still getting used to the silence where it used to be. Ethan was at the bakery door at 6 o'clock. He had his good coat on the dark one, and his hat was brushed, and he looked at her when she opened the door, the same way he always looked at her, straight on, without qualification. "Ready," he said. "I've been ready for about 15 years, she said. He smiled and offered his arm. They walked down the main road to the Grange Hall, where the social was held every year, and Clara was aware of every set of eyes that tracked them from windows and doorways, and she felt it the way she'd been feeling Willow Creek's attention for months now, noted, not weighted, not hers to carry. The Grange Hall was full. Every family in the county came to the autumn social, which meant that the room contained in one convenient location every person who had ever whispered about Clara Whitmore, every person who had ever warned someone away from her, every person who had looked at her and seen too much, and also the 3 families whose credit she still carried, and Pete and 2 other ranch hands from the Callahan spread who were there with the barely concealed excitement of young men at a social event, with music, and Margaret Hollis standing near the far wall, who saw them come in and did something with her chin that was the closest she had ever come to nodding in approval. Clara saw all of it. She held Ethan's arm and she saw all of it, and she let herself be seen. The first 20 minutes were the hardest because 20 minutes was about how long it took for a room to absorb a new reality and rearrange itself around it. People came to speak to Ethan and found themselves speaking to Clara as well, and navigated this with varying degrees of grace. Some were stiff, some overcompensated with warmth. Some were simply decent the way people could be when they were removed from the specific social pressure that had been operating on them all summer. Then the music started. Ethan looked at her. "I should tell you," he said close enough that she could hear him without raising his voice, "that I am not a graceful dancer." "How ungraceful are we talking?" "I have been asked to stop on 2 separate occasions." "By the same person?" "Different events, different states." He looked entirely serious. "I want you to know this before I ask." Clara looked at him. This man who had ridden into her bakery looking for bread and had ended up through some combination of stubbornness and decency and the particular quality of his attention rearranging the whole of her life. "Ask anyway," she said. He asked. They danced. He was as advertised, not graceful, but he was present completely the way he was present in everything, and he held her with the steady certainty of a man who had decided where he was and was not going to be moved. And Clara Whitmore danced at the Willow Creek Autumn Social with her head up and her back straight, and the full unguarded smile on her face that she had stopped apologizing for. The room adjusted around them. Not all at once, not dramatically. But she could feel it, the specific shift in the atmosphere of a place when it stops waiting for something to fall apart and starts reluctantly recognizing that it isn't going to. It was Ruth Deaver who surprised her most. Ruth found her near the refreshment table between dances when Ethan had been pulled into a conversation with one of the neighboring ranchers, and Ruth looked at Clara with an expression that had shed most of its usual sharp edges. "I owe you an apology too," Ruth said. Clara looked at her. "I have said things to you over the years," Ruth said, "under the guise of concern that were not kind. I told you what I believed the world would offer you, and I dressed it up as honesty." She paused. "I've been thinking about Margaret's words at the prayer circle last month, about what we've done to you over the years." "What did Margaret say?" Clara asked, genuinely curious. Ruth pressed her lips together briefly. "She said we had spent 15 years telling you to expect less, and called it wisdom, and that she was ashamed of it, and that if any of us had an ounce of the sense we credited ourselves with, we'd spend the next 15 years trying to make up for it." She met Clara's eyes. She was right. Clara thought about the Margaret Hollis who had come into her bakery 2 weeks ago and said she was glad. She thought about the woman who had been coming in every Tuesday morning for 15 years with her tight bun and her tight opinions and her very specific brand of damage. And she thought about how people contained multitudes, and how that was both the most frustrating and the most hopeful thing about them. "I appreciate you saying so," Clara said. "Is there anything—" Ruth stopped. I suppose I'm asking if there is anything we can do. Practically. Not to make up for it, I understand that's not possible, but to— Stop, Clara said simply. That's what you can do. Stop doing it. To me and to anyone else, this town has decided is too much. She met Ruth's eyes. That would mean more than any apology. Ruth nodded. It was a small nod, but a real one. All right, she said. She moved away. Clara stood at the refreshment table and thought about the texture of change, how it was never the dramatic reversal you imagined, never the moment when everyone turned at once and saw you clearly. It was this. Small conversations and small nods, and one person at a time deciding to be different. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. Ethan found her 20 minutes later. What are you thinking about? He said, reading her face. About how change is slower and smaller than you expect, she said, and how that's actually all right. He looked at her. Ruth Deaver talked to you, he said. Is it that obvious? You have a specific expression when someone has surprised you by being decent, he said. It's a good expression. I like seeing it on you. She looked at him. Ethan, she said, you said it depended on how the social went. He went still. I did say that, he said. How do you think it's going? He looked around the room at Willow Creek in its autumn social best, at the evidence of a town that was slow and imperfect and adjusting, and then he looked back at her. I think it's going well, he said. Then how far away is eventually? She said. He reached into the inside pocket of his good coat, and Clara's breath stopped. He held a ring between his fingers. Not elaborate, not showy. A simple gold band with a small dark stone that caught the light from the Grange Hall lanterns. The kind of ring a man bought when he was thinking about something that was going to last. Not very far, he said quietly. The room continued around them. The music played. People talked and danced and helped themselves to the refreshment table and did all the things people did at autumn socials in small Montana towns. None of them in that particular moment were paying attention to the corner near the door where Ethan Callahan was looking at Clara Whitmore with a ring in his hand. It was the most private moment she had ever had in Willow Creek. I'm not doing this on one knee in front of a room full of people, he said. You're not a performance and this isn't a show. His voice was low and steady and completely certain. But I am asking, clearly, with full knowledge of who you are and what this town has said and everything that has happened in the last 4 months. He paused. I am asking if you will marry me, Clara. Not because you need someone to take care of you, because you don't. Not because I want to rescue you, because you haven't needed rescuing since before I arrived. But because I want to build something with you. Something permanent. And I don't want to wait any longer to say so out loud. Clara looked at the ring. She looked at the man holding it. She thought about every reason she'd collected over 29 years not to do this, the careful architecture of self-protection she'd built over a decade and a half of being told she was too much. She walked through all of it the way you walked through a room you were leaving, acknowledging what was there, not needing to take it with you. She thought about bread that didn't lie. She thought about a man who came back, and came back, and came back again. Yes, she said. Simple. Absolute. No qualifications. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it, sitting there in the lantern light, and felt the specific sensation of something that had been held in suspension for a very long time, finally landing somewhere solid. I should warn you, she said. I know, he said. You're not easy. I was going to say, I'm going to want to keep the bakery, I assumed, he said. I'd be offended if you didn't. And I'm going to have opinions about how the ranch is run. I'm counting on it. My operations management has gaps. And I argue. Constantly, he agreed. And you're almost always right, which is the part I've decided to find endearing rather than maddening. She looked up at him. Almost always, she said. The book, he said. You were wrong about the book. I was not wrong about the book. That he said. And there was that full smile again, the one that changed his whole face, is exactly what I mean. She laughed. He put his hand over hers, the one with the ring, and they stood in the corner of the Grange Hall in Willow Creek, Montana, and the music played. And outside the October wind moved through the streets of a town that had spent years trying to tell this woman who she was, and had been wrong about every word of it. They told people at the end of the evening. They didn't announce it formally because Clara had no interest in standing up in front of a room and being looked at. And Ethan understood this without being told. Instead, they simply allowed the ring to be visible and allowed Willow Creek to do what Willow Creek did with visible information. Pete was the first to notice. He came over with the specific energy of a young man who has figured something out approximately 3 seconds before he thought he would. "Miss Whitmore," he said, then stopped recalibrated. Did you... He looked at Ethan. "Did you ask her?" "I did," Ethan said. Pete's face did something complicated and entirely genuine that involved trying not to look as pleased as he clearly was. "Well," he said. "Good." He looked at Clara. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me saying, you're the best thing that's happened to this ranch since we got the new well dug." Clara looked at Ethan. "High praise," she said. "That well changed our lives," Ethan said seriously. "I'm honored," she said. And she was laughing again, that unguarded laugh, and Pete was grinning, and the 2 other ranch hands who'd come over to see what Pete was doing added their own awkward congratulations with hat tipping and yes ma'ams, and it was so entirely different from anything Clara had imagined when she'd let herself imagine this that it was better. It was so much better. Margaret Hollis noticed the ring 40 minutes later. She came over with the deliberate walk of a woman who has made a decision and is implementing it, and she looked at Clara's hand, and then at Clara's face, and then at Ethan, and she said, "Mr. Callahan, you are a man of considerably better judgment than I gave you credit for." "Thank you, Mrs. Hollis," Ethan said. "And Clara." She stopped. Something in her face was doing what it had done in the bakery, the complicated thing, the one that was trying to find its way to something more honest than what she'd been trained to say. "I am glad for you, genuinely." "I know you are," Clara said. And she did know. That was the thing. That was the part that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago, that she would say those words to Margaret Hollis and mean them without irony. Margaret left with her chin up and her back straight, and Clara could see in the set of her shoulders the particular posture of a woman who had said something true and was going to have to live with having said it, which was its own kind of courage. The evening wound down the way autumn socials did gradually, with families beginning to drift toward the door, and ranch hands checking the time, and children who had long since fallen asleep being carried out by their fathers. Ethan and Clara left together. They walked back down the main road in the cold October dark. Her hand through his arm, the ring cool against her finger, and Willow Creek was quiet around them, the way it got late on a cold night, the particular quiet of a place that has spent all its energy and settled into itself. "Henry Pruitt didn't come tonight," Clara said. "No." "Did you notice?" "I noticed," Ethan said. "I thought it was wise of him." She thought about that for a moment. "Do you think he'll make more trouble?" "Probably," Ethan said. "Men like Pruitt don't stop because they've lost a round. They regroup." He paused. "But Whitfield's investigation is moving. The land office contacted Pruitt directly last week. That's going to occupy him considerably." "You knew about that." "Whitfield wrote to me." She looked at him. "You've been keeping track of all of this," she said. "I've been keeping track of anything that might come at you," he said simply. "That's not going to stop being something I do." She thought about the difference between being managed and being protected. She had spent years confusing the two or more precisely. She had spent years being told they were the same thing, and had believed it, and what Ethan had done for the past 4 months had clarified the distinction with a precision that 15 years of living alone hadn't. Being managed meant someone making decisions for you. Being protected meant someone standing beside you while you made your own. "I want to know when you're doing it," she said. Even if I can't always help, I don't want to find out after the fact." "That's fair," he said. "I'll tell you. And I want to be part of the conversations. With Whitfield, with whoever else is involved. Also fair. I'm serious, Ethan. This is my life they're talking about, my business, my standing in this town." "I know," he said, "and I should have included you from the beginning. I didn't because I was trying to handle it before it worried you, which was a decision I made for you instead of with you." He looked at her. "That was wrong. I won't do it again." She studied him for a moment. He meant it. That was the thing about Ethan Callahan that she had learned over 4 months of watching him carefully. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And when he was wrong about something, and someone told him clearly, he acknowledged it and adjusted. He did not defend his position past the point of reason. He did not make her feel difficult for expecting to be treated as a partner. She had not known that was possible. She was learning slowly, and sometimes with difficulty, to believe it was real. "All right," she said. They reached the bakery door. She turned to face him in the cold October dark. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to answer honestly, even if you think the honest answer will worry me." "All right," he said. "Are you certain," she said, "about this, about me, about what it means to be attached to a woman this town has spent 15 years deciding isn't worth choosing?" She held his gaze. "Because the ring is on my finger now, and Margaret Hollis has been gracious, and Pete is enthusiastic, and it all feels very possible tonight. But I have had things feel possible before, and I know what mourning looks like when the feeling wears off." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "I grew up watching my father hold on to a ranch that was too small and too difficult because he believed it was worth building," he said. "And I watched men in Kansas City and St. Louis walk away from things that were worth building because the building was hard." He paused. "I know the difference between wanting something when it's easy and knowing something when it's not." "That's not quite what I asked," she said. "I know." He was quiet for a beat. "I am certain, Clara. Not because it will be easy. It won't be. Pruitt will make more trouble, and this town will have opinions forever, and you will argue with me about books and ranch management and probably every decision I make for the next 40 years. He looked at her steadily. "I am certain because I have spent 4 months watching you be exactly who you are under every kind of pressure this town could apply, and I have not once in that entire time wanted to be anywhere else." She held that. She let it be true. 40 years, she said. "At least," he said. She looked at the ring in the dark, at the simple gold band with the dark stone that he had put in his coat pocket before a social event, because he had already decided and was only waiting for the right moment. "I should tell you something," she said, "about myself." "Tell me." "I am going to be bad at this," she said. "Not always, but sometimes. Sometimes I am going to pull back when I should stay open, and I am going to expect the worst when things get hard, and I am going to need you to be patient in ways that are probably more than you're bargaining for." "Clara," he said, "I'm serious. I know you are." His voice was patient and certain and warm in the cold night air. "I'm not marrying the version of you that has already healed from everything this town did. I'm marrying the woman who is right here carrying all of it, doing her best with what she has." He paused. "The pulling back and the expecting the worst and the difficulty with trust, that's not something I need you to fix before you're worthy of being chosen. You're already worthy. You have always been worthy." He looked at her with complete seriousness. "The rest we figure out together. That's what together means." Clara Whitmore, who did not cry easily, who had not cried in years, felt the back of her eyes go hot. She did not cry, but it was a near thing. "Together," she said. "Together," he said. She went inside. She stood in the dark bakery and did not light the lamp right away. Just stood in the particular dark of a place she had built and kept and defended for 15 years, with the ring on her finger and the cold October night outside. And she felt the shape of her life the way you felt the shape of something when you finally set it down after carrying it for a long time. It felt lighter than she'd expected. Not because anything had been resolved entirely. Not because Pruitt was finished or the town was transformed or the list of everything she'd survived had somehow been retroactively made easier. None of that was true. It felt lighter because she was not carrying it alone anymore. She lit the lamp. She sat down at the back table where she kept the ledger and the tin box with the important papers, and she looked at the ring in the lamplight, and she thought about the letter she was going to write tomorrow to the billing supplier confirming the next quarter's order, and about the adjustments she needed to make to the credit system now that Frank Deaver had reinstated the account, and about the October bread order for the Callahan Ranch that was already planned out through November. She thought about all the practical, real, ordinary things that made up a life. And she thought about a man who was going to be part of all of them. The twist that no one in Willow Creek had seen coming arrived 10 days later. It arrived in the form of a document delivered to Clara's bakery by a writer from the Territorial Land Office in Helena. She signed for it, which she almost never did, because official documents almost never came to her, and she opened it at the back table with a slightly accelerated pulse that she told herself was not anxiety. It was not a threatening document. It was, in fact, the opposite. The Territorial Land Office had been investigating the water rights applications Henry Pruitt had filed over the past decade. James Whitfield's information had accelerated an inquiry that had apparently already been underway. In the course of that inquiry, certain documentation had come to light regarding Clara's father's original property filings, the land on which the bakery stood, which had been disputed by Pruitt's family when her father was alive and had remained in a kind of unresolved limbo in the territorial records ever since. The document in her hands was the resolution. Her father had been right. The property was hers clearly and legally and without question, and the Territorial Land Office was formally notifying her of that fact as a direct result of the Pruitt investigation, which had surfaced the original disputed filing and cleared it. She sat at the back table with the document in her hands and thought about her father, who had died still worrying about the property filing, still afraid that Pruitt's family had the right of it, still uncertain whether the bakery would be legally hers when he was gone. He had been right. All along he had been right. She sat there for a long time. When Ethan came Thursday, she was waiting with the document on the counter and the specific expression he had learned to recognize as something significant having happened. He read it without speaking. When he looked up, she said, "My father died not knowing." "I know." His voice was quiet. "Pruitt's family filed a counterclaim on the property when my father was trying to establish the bakery. It was one of the things that made his last years difficult." She paused. He never knew it had been resolved in his favor because it was buried in the territorial records for 20 years. Ethan set the document down carefully. "Whitfield's investigation found it," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Your father was right," he said. "He built something on solid ground even when Pruitt was trying to tell him otherwise." He paused. "Sound familiar?" She looked at the document and then at him, and then for the first time in the entire conversation, she let out a long, slow breath. "He would have liked you," she said. "My father." "Tell me about him," Ethan said. So she did. She sat across the counter from Ethan Callahan on a Thursday morning in October and told him about her father, who had come to Montana from Tennessee with $40 and a skill for baking that he'd learned from his own mother, who had believed that feeding people was honest work, and honest work was its own dignity, who had built the bakery from a lean-to operation into a proper business and had spent the last years of his life fighting quietly against a man who wanted to take what he'd built. She told Ethan about the way her father had smelled like bread and wood smoke, about the way he'd taught her to listen to the dough to know by the feel of it under her hands whether it needed more time, about the particular sound he made when he was pleased with a batch, a low satisfied that she had been hearing in her memory for 15 years. She talked for almost an hour. Ethan listened to all of it. He didn't say things like, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "he sounds like he was a good man." The standard phrases people offered when the thing they meant was, "I don't know what to say, but I want you to know I was listening." He just listened, actually listened the way he always did, with the specific quality of attention she had been falling in love with for 4 months. When she finished, he said, "He raised someone who kept what he built and made it stronger." "I tried to," she said. "You didn't try," he said. "You did." She looked at the document on the counter. "I'm going to have it framed," she said. "Put it on the wall." "Good," he said. "Put it where people can see it." She nodded. The week before the wedding, something happened that Clara had not expected. People helped, not because she'd asked, not because Ethan had arranged it, simply because they showed up one by one in the particular way that communities sometimes did when they had been wrong about something long enough to feel the weight of it. Ruth Deaver brought fabric for a wedding dress without being asked good wool in a deep green that was exactly right and said only, "I've been holding this for a while. I think I was holding it for you." The Henderson family, whose apple crates had started everything, came by with 4 jars of apple preserve and an offer to help with the wedding food. They stayed half the day, and their oldest daughter, who was 12, said to Clara, with the frank directness of children, "Are you going to be Mrs. Callahan now?" "I am," Clara said. "That's good," the girl said. "Mr. Callahan always looks happier when he comes in here." Pete organized the ranch hands into a sort of unofficial honor guard for the wedding day, which involved a significant amount of hat brushing and very serious discussions about posture that Clara overheard through the bakery window one morning and had to press her hand over her mouth to keep from laughing. Even Frank Deaver came by awkward and determined with a bolt of ribbon for decoration and the air of a man who was doing penance in the most practical way he could think of. "It's not enough," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "But it's something." He nodded and left, and Clara held the ribbon in her hands and thought about penance and repair and the slow, imperfect work of communities trying to be better than they'd been. The wedding was small. They had both wanted small. Clara, because she had never needed a performance, Ethan, because he'd been to large weddings and found them exhausting. They were married by Reverend Paulson on a Thursday morning in early November outside the bakery, because Clara had specifically requested outside the bakery in front of the door her father had built and the sign she had painted herself after the windstorm. Approximately 30 people were there. Pete cried, which he denied afterward with great conviction. Margaret Hollis stood in the front and looked at Clara with an expression that Clara had never seen on her face before, and which she could only describe as pride, and it was strange and complicated, and she received it with the generosity she was learning to apply to imperfect people. Ethan said his vows in the particular plain, certain way he said everything that was true, looking at her directly without ceremony. Clara said hers. She had written them herself. She had sat at the back table 3 evenings ago with a lamp and a piece of paper, and had written them, and crossed them out and written them again until they were exactly what she meant. She said them now. "I have spent most of my life being told what I was worth," she said. "By this town, by people who thought they knew, by my own voice, which learned their opinions and repeated them until I almost believed it." She looked at Ethan. "You came into my bakery looking for bread, and you found me instead, and you looked at me like I was exactly what you were looking for, and you never once in all the months that followed gave me a reason to believe otherwise." She paused. "I don't know how to be easy. I know how to be honest and how to work hard and how to show up every morning and do what needs to be done. I know how to build things and keep them." She held his gaze. "I will build this with you. I will keep it. I will show up every morning. And I will never in all the years we have let you wonder whether you chose right." Ethan's jaw moved. He was not by nature a man whose feelings showed on his face. They showed then. "You're exactly right," he said. It was not in his vows. It was just what came out of him low and certain before Reverend Paulson finished the words. "You are exactly completely right." Reverend Paulson, to his credit, kept going. They were married under a November sky in front of the door her father had built with Pete, trying not to cry on one side, and Margaret Hollis standing straight on the other, and 30 people who had spent years failing this woman and were here now, because even late, was better than never. In the years that followed, Willow Creek remembered the Callahans the way communities remembered things that had reshaped them, not as a lesson exactly, and not as a story they were proud of at every point, but as something true. They remembered that Clara Whitmore had run the bakery through two of the worst winters anyone could recall, and had never once turned away a family who needed bread and couldn't pay. They remembered that she had built a credit system that had kept 12 families functioning during the Pruitt years, when the county's economics were being quietly manipulated in ways that didn't fully come to light until the territorial investigation concluded. They remembered that Ethan Callahan had turned down a job offer in Colorado and hadn't seemed to find it a difficult decision. They remembered too, though they didn't often say it directly, that they had spent a long time telling this woman she was too much. And they understood in the way that communities understood things they would rather not examine too directly what that had cost her, what it had cost all of them. Henry Pruitt's situation resolved itself the way situations like his eventually did. The Territorial Land Office's investigation took 2 years to conclude formally, and resulted in a significant restructuring of his water rights holdings, and a formal censure from the County Land Commission. He remained in Willow Creek diminished and quieter than he'd been, and Clara passed him on the main road occasionally without rancor and without warmth. The way you passed someone who had tried to do you real damage and had failed, and whose failure had freed you, and whose presence in your life was now simply neutral, which was all you'd ever really needed it to be. The bakery thrived. It thrived because Clara was good at what she did, and had always been good at what she did, and because the billing supply contract proved more stable than the Helena one had ever been, and because Ethan's advance payment had given her the foundation to expand the credit system to 2 additional families, and still maintain her margins. It thrived because Pete and the ranch hands told every passing traveler and every cattle drive that came through Willow Creek that the best bread west of St. Louis was available on the main road, which was marketing she hadn't asked for and couldn't have purchased. It thrived because Clara Whitmore knew how to build things. She had always known how to build things. She had simply needed to stop being surrounded by people who were trying to convince her she didn't. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Ethan came downstairs before sunrise to find Clara already at the oven with her hands in the dough, and he stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she heard him. "You're up early," she said without turning around. "Couldn't sleep. The anniversary." She smiled at the dough. "You were thinking." "I was thinking," he agreed. He came to stand beside her. "About a year ago, outside this door. I was thinking about that too." "What were you thinking?" he said. She turned and looked at him in the lamplight of the early morning bakery. This man who had come in looking for bread and had stayed for everything else. "I was thinking," she said, "that I have not once in the entire year woken up and expected the floor to drop out." He looked at her. "Not once," she said, "after 29 years of expecting it every single morning." "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." He put his arms around her flour-dusted hands and all, and she let him. And she leaned into it with the specific ease of a woman who had learned finally, and for good, that being held was not the same as being diminished. Outside, Willow Creek was waking up. The main road was beginning its morning sounds, boots on boardwalk and a wagon somewhere in the distance, and the particular quiet of a November morning that was cold and clear and full of the promise of an ordinary day. Clara Whitmore, who was Clara Callahan, now stood in her bakery, in the arms of a man who had chosen her exactly as she was, and felt the shape of a life that had been built hard and kept harder and was finally completely fully hers. She had never been too much. She had always been exactly enough. And she had known it deep down, even in the worst of the years, even when every voice around her said otherwise. She had known it because her father had known it, and because the bread didn't lie, and because a woman who gets up before the sun every morning and builds the fire and does the work because she believes it is worth doing is not a woman who is too much for this world. She is the woman the world was not yet ready for. And Ethan Callahan, on a summer afternoon in 1882, had ridden into Willow Creek and looked at her across a flour-dusted counter and known it from the very first moment. He had simply been waiting for her to believe it too, and now she did. She absolutely, finally, and forever did.